So I've recently been interacting with a bunch of atheists, and again, the chief concern they tend to raise with Christianity is how it seems to be so unscrupulous and dismissive of seeming evils within the actual Bible, the Holy Book. They point to examples in the Old Testament where a command for war has been given, and they'll say how this seems to be in contradiction to the Christian ethic that we read of in the New Testament. And it's very true, but the thing is, they present it as if this is an issue that only they're aware of, and as if we're all ignorant of it, and as if there's no one in the Christian tradition who's ever sat back and thought to themselves, and really I have done that. Only me, that's me. I'm not going to say anyone else does that. I'm just a bit crazy, but other people contemplate it without rocking back and forth in their chair, saying, But no, you're not the only one to have thought of that. There are volumes upon volumes of critical analysis within the tradition of Christianity addressing this very issue, the problem of evil, and certain contradictions as well that are found, seeming contradictions found within the Old Testament that seem to run against the Christian ethic we read of in the New Testament. And the thing that I've been thinking about recently is how Jesus Christ came to reveal God to the masses, to the people of his time, and his record of what he done in his life is there for us to analyse today. And when we look at the record of his life, when we look at the God that Jesus Christ came to reveal, there does seem to be something of a contradiction. So what can we do with this? Well, within the Christian tradition, there are different ways of interpreting different things, and there's all different kinds of doctrines in that, and there's very much there is acrimony within the Christian tradition. There are different denominations that tend to think that other denominations are hell-bound and all the rest of it, and it's not nice. I would call these Christians immature, and the thing I want the unbeliever to believe who's watching this, the thing I want the atheist to do is to be charitable and to just listen and to pay heed and to not to be so dismissive, because I understand that when you're within a particular group, be it atheism or a denomination of Christianity, you are unwilling to lend your ear to the opposition because you don't want to hear it, and anything that they say is just some kind of trivial attempt to justify their belief system. And we can't be like that. We need to say, well, okay, is there some kind of sense to the narrative? Is there something to their way of interpretation that seems to make sense, that I can really sit there and think about and come to the conclusion that, yeah, I think that makes more sense than the other position. Ultimately, we're all given a measure of common sense, aren't we? And like I say, I agree with... I can agree, I can be charitable, and I can listen to opposing views, and that's something we need to be willing to do, because I get that sometimes we get frustrated and we can just be flippant and dismissive, and certain responses to questions and stuff can sound very evasive, and that just frustrates us. But I'm not going to do that here. Now, within Christianity, there's a tradition that says that the Bible is inerrant. There are no inaccuracies in the Bible. It's all perfectly accurate and wonderful, and everything in it needs to be taken at face value and all the rest of it. And then there's different interpretations from between that and other extremes. And well, the reason a lot of people flocked to YouTube to debate, this whole Christian atheist thing that went on for a while, it all kind of ran around creationism and evolution, and this sort of led atheists to be the champions of science and all the rest of it. They ran with the mainstream scientific narrative, whereas the Christians ran against that to their detriment and sort of made themselves look silly. Now, not all of them, because there are very proactive scientific minds in the Christian tradition, lending their intellect to the advancement of science and so forth. So we need to be aware of that, and not generalize and undermine people just for the sake of a wee cheap win, But certainly that was a big thing on here, and people were defending how the world was created in 6 days, which I think most of us now believe to be nonsense. Because the thing is, when you join a religion and you open up that book, and there's a sense of majesty about it, and then you're told through however, I don't know who's telling you, or through what means the information gets to you, but you're told that, by the way, the world was created in 6 days, and then you read in this book that there's a 6 day creation narrative myth in there, and you think to yourself, well, that must be true because this is the book of truth. But really, you've just misinterpreted it or been misinformed, and you don't know that, and you're overzealous, and you want to be God's warrior in the world or whatever, you know what I mean? You want to be the one, blazing a trail for God. So, you call it the zeal of the convert, and it happens in different things. Like if you convert to atheism, you're going to be ruthless and aggressive in your atheism, and you're going to be like, no, you're silly people, there's no God, It's the same with Christianity. You're zealous about Christianity. What do you mean evolution and all the rest of it? The world was created in several hours, when really you go back and you study and then you see, there's mainstream Hebraic scholars telling us now that it's a poem, and we don't need that, do we? Because we know that it's not an accurate textbook description of how the world was made. The story's there to communicate covenant with God, relationship with God, and that's what the subject of this video is going to be about. It's going to be about, like, how do we treat this book? Because in the olden days, in the Middle Ages, people like me would never have access to a Bible. The Bible was held by the establishment, by your Catholic. It was in your Catholic tradition. That it was written in Latin, and I wouldn't even be able to read it because I wouldn't even be literate. I wouldn't be able to read, so I had to rely on what the establishment told me about the religion. But then, over time, the book was translated into English, and people became more literate, and then they could read the book for themselves, and they could say, well, no, there's something wrong here. There's something wrong with how people are doing this. I'm looking at Jesus and I'm seeing a different pattern for life, and I think people are missing the boat. And then, so you have the Protestant movement, and then from the Protestant movement, you have people who continue to protest and then build their own denominations or move toward unbelief and focus on other things, and then society changes and la-da-da. You know the story. You're part of the story. So I want to deal with the Old Testament because people point to the Old Testament and they say, look, in this book, God has just told these Jewish people to go and slay so many people, and it doesn't look good. But then when we look at Jesus, and we look what he does and the God he came to convey to the world, we see some kind of a contrast. And this has led to a belief that the God is not a common belief because it's highly controversial. But there's this belief that the God within Christian tradition, that the God of the Old Testament is an entirely different God to the God of the New Testament, the God that Jesus came to reveal. I should know the name of that. It's amillennialism. Look it up. But just let's not get stuck up on the jargon. But that's the belief that people had back in the day. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And some people might still hold to this belief. And maybe there's something to it. Now, I don't believe it's true. I don't believe it's accurate. But maybe there's something to this idea that, wait a minute, there is a difference. The God of the Old Testament is, you read things in the Old Testament. God tells you that he's the creator of good and he's the creator of evil, or as some people might think of it, function and dysfunction. He's the author of it all. And then it's only really within the New Testament that we start to see this conceptualization of a Satan, of an adversary that's got some kind of autonomous agency apart from God. We see this developing, and even demons, within the Old Testament, you don't read anything about demonic possession or anything like that. We only really see demons and demonic possession featuring in the New Testament of the Bible. So, there's people like Christadelphians who believe that this whole demon thing was just some kind of, it's phenomenological language, and all it's really saying is these people had mental issues, but they thought they were demon possessed, and Jesus wasn't going to, it wasn't his place to correct them and try and deal with these people. He's like, all right, the demon's away, and there was some kind of miraculous injection of anti-psychosis there. I'm not going to play it down, folks. If you're watching this as a non-believer, I do believe in miracles. I do believe in supernatural events happening in the natural universe. But I know that's a tricky subject, a stumbling block, to use biblical prose. But we'll deal with that later. Just you've got to be charitable, as I said, to have the discussion. So. What I'm thinking of recently is how these ancient Jews may have misconstrued, in a sense, in some places, how God was. The way God was feeling about certain things. They might have run under the banner of God and done things contrary to the Spirit of God. And this is the history that you read of in the narrative of the Old Testament, in the Tanakh. We see here a people who have a relationship with God. That relationship degenerates because of their behavior. The relationship comes back together. It degenerates again. And we see this struggle. We see this struggle with God, which is what Israel means, struggling with God. This struggle between man and God. And we see it in King David. King David was a rather... would I say brutal? Would I say savage? A wild man. Let's call him a wild man, right? He was a man after God's heart. He was a passionate man. He was a passionate man with a big heart, but also a sort of fiery temperament. And, when he wanted to construct a temple to his God, when David wanted to construct the temple, God said about David, no, you won't do it because you're a man of war. You're a man of the sword, and I won't have you build my temple. Because we read this in there, and it's almost as if we're like, wait a minute, if this God is the God of war, it would seem in some places, if he's sending people out to war, then why is he saying this about David? Why is he saying to David, you slew people and you shed blood, so I can't have anything, I can't have you building my temple? What's up with God here? So here's part of a discussion I want to share with you. I'm balancing my laptop on a column of styrofoam right now, so if this all topples, just see it as some kind of poetic thing, right? So this is an extract from a discussion. It's not too long, but this kind of covers everything I want to discuss. This is an extract from a discussion about the nature of God the Father, right? Because as I said, we have this God the Father conveyed, manifested, and shown to the world through the work and testimony of Jesus. And he's the highest authority that we should go to and look to for a representation of God the Father. And there's all kinds of things said about the Old Testament. I know Christian brothers who think that the Old Testament is a thoroughly unreliable book. Thoroughly unreliable. They'll think it's maybe been it's full of concocted stories, and there's some kind of like motive in there that's not pure running through it. You know what I mean? Just kind of sell the Jewish tradition. I don't know. I can't really speak to that. I'm not really well researched on it. I just want to share with you some ideas and let you know that Christianity is a fluctuating, growing, evolving spiritual thing. It doesn't change. The heart of it doesn't change. It never will change. And we all know the fruits of the Spirit of God. We all follow, as Christians, the life, the way shown by Jesus. That will never change. But everything around that, like what happened before Jesus and what we're doing after, that's all up for discussion, I think. Somebody will disagree with me, but that's the nature of this whole thing. So here's someone who believes that the God of the Old Testament, who seemed to permit war, is reliably reported. He says this, he says, the Bible is inhumanely consistent in portraying Yahweh/Jesus, as a warrior king who finally balances the demands of upholding his honour with the demands of his complete devotion to his covenant people, the Jews. It sounds like you just don't like God's actual character, so you're trying to reinvent him around Jesus, forgetting that Jesus himself upheld the Torah's portrayal of Yahweh and stated that the scripture cannot be broken. You're trying to conflate one of Jesus' missions, the self-sacrificial one, with his entire character, forgetting that his next mission is the one the Jews originally expected, the one where he conquers the world. To be totally blunt with you, your Jesus strikes me as a limp-wristed, pansy-ass Nancy boy. So this is what one Christian said to another Christian. And he's obviously a futurist. He's expecting some dramatic return of Jesus riding on a cloud and in the sky, I guess. And I'm not of that tradition. I'm a preterist. I'm someone who looks at the testament of Jesus Christ, and when Jesus says things like, I will have returned in the 1st century before you have finished preaching my message in the towns of Israel. He says this a couple of times, and he says things like that hundreds of times. Not just him, but his disciples say that he will return hundreds of times in the New Testament. Assuredly I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not die before the Son of Man comes in his kingdom. And, assuredly I say to you, within this generation, the vindication of the martyrs, which is an absolute red flag. It should shine in our faces and tell us that this is the culmination of the age. Because it's about covenant eschatology. It's about the end of the old covenant and the beginning of the new one, which we're currently in, where there is no more sea, as it says in Revelation. Sorry if this sounds a bit theological, but it's a small point to get this across. In the book of Revelation, it speaks of a new world, a new heavens and a new earth. And in the new earth, there is no more sea. Well, new heavens, new earth, that's just an idiom for new covenant. And in this new covenant, there's no more sea. Sea is a term used to describe Gentile nations, Israel, the land, and then the sea, the Gentile nations round about it. In the new world, there's no more sea, and everyone who thirsts may drink from the spring of life, which means they may have relationship with God. Everyone. And even in, I won't get into, I'll leave that there for you, right? So I'm a preterist. Anyway, this person expects a future coming of Christ to conquer. And you can see the dilemma here. He's saying, look, wait, people who are going to make the case that, God is somehow being identified in the Old Testament. He's saying, no, wait, you're just conflating a particular mission of Jesus, God, with God the Father in the Old Testament. It's very complicated. I'm not a Trinitarian either, so it gets very complicated. Hey, that's just part of the nature of it. But that's all stuff that we don't need to get too much into here. So he said his piece about making Jesus out to be a limp-wristed pansy. So here's the response to this guy. He says, concerning Jude 5, the original manuscript does not say Jesus but Kyrios, which means Lord. Now this may be a moot point considering we believe that Jesus is Lord, but let's deal with the language that is actually used. The apostles were Jews, and as I noted, the Hebraic scriptures are not at all consistent through thousands of years on the nature of God. There is much conversation and debate going on through Israel's history, and their scriptures reflect that. The Bible, particularly the Old Testament, shows an evolution, a progression of thought concerning the divine. Coming out of the pagan cultures of the earth, Israel's faith evolved from polytheism or henotheism to monotheism. Just as with many concepts in the Bible, through its different authors and writings spanning thousands of years, we see the plurality of views wrestling with each other and coming to new ways of thinking concerning the nature of the divine. The multivocal nature of the Bible, instead of being seen as a threat, shaking the self-certain evangelicals' insistence of inerrancy, it should be viewed as a beautiful testament to the faithful universal presence that is drawing us up and forward into truth, relating to us where we are at and summoning us or summoning history toward himself. Passages in the Hebraic Bible assume the existence of other gods and can be compared to other passages that declare that there are no gods besides the God of Israel. God has taken his place in the divine council in the midst of the gods he holds judgment. Psalm 82:1. The term divine council is used by Hebrew and Semitic scholars to refer to the heavenly host, the pantheon of divine beings who administer the affairs of the cosmos. All ancient Mediterranean cultures had some conception of a divine council. The divine council of Israelite religion, known primarily through the Psalms, was distinct in important ways. With this in mind, you have an evolving understanding of God and his relation to humanity through the Hebraic scriptures. Israel's strict monotheistic creed caused them to attribute all things good and evil to God. But as revelation progressed, they realized that they could not attribute both good and evil to God, so the idea of the Satan, the adversary, began developing. This is why everything is attributed to God in the Old Testament, and the Satan is only mentioned 18 times, and only as a servant of God that carries out God's adversarial destructive work. When Christ came, he was careful to differentiate his Abba from the Satan. Jesus divorced the adversary, the stealer, killer, and destroyer, from our concept of God. God is only good and only gives good things. He causes his rain to shine. He causes what? I misread that. He causes his rain and sunshine to fall on both the good and the evil. The Satan steals, kills, and destroys. God gives life. There is not a consistent view of the Satan in the Bible. It is progressive. The concept of Satan evolves from the servant of God who administers God's destructive will in the Old Testament to cosmic rebel who God has come to cast out in the New Testament. Since no longer could everything be attributed to God, notice that all of a sudden the Satan is mentioned hundreds of times in the New Testament, whereas in the Old Testament he's only mentioned 18 times. Think about that for a second. The Old Testament, a portion of the Bible that is 2/3 of the Bible and covers thousands of years of Israel's history, has the Satan only mentioned 18 times, whereas the New Testament, a portion of the Bible that takes up a third of the Bible, was written simply to testify of Jesus, and what he revealed, has Satan mentioned hundreds of times. This should give us pause. What do we find revealed in the life of Jesus? We find a clear and consistent ethic of non-violence, enemy-loving, peacemaking, and reconciliation, teaching that he comes to bring life and he is the image of his Abba, his Father, while at the same time warnings of the self-destructive consequences of sin and harsh rebukes against the religious who misinterpret his Abba. Jesus is not a hypocrite. He doesn't command enemy love and then violently kill his enemies. Nowhere is violence and destruction found in the actions of God where he walked into history in the flesh and blood Son. So what of Jude? Jude is still participating in the conversation around who God is who God is that is going on in the Hebraic scriptures. He's still operating in that paradigm of God that draws little distinction between God and the adversary, Satan. In the Old Testament stories, there is often little distinction between the wrath of God and the violence of the destroyer. The destroyer is virtually God's hitman sent on missions to keep God's hands clean. But Jesus and Paul draw a sharp distinction. God is always a life giver and redeemer. Satan is the death dealer and destroyer. What have we seen in Scripture and in our experience? First, that God in his love grants authentic freedom to humanity and to the natural and supernatural forces of the world. God in his wrath also consents to permit and not spare the powerful consequences of these forces to take their course. And so in the Bible, where we see or hear of God's wrath, what we actually witness is God's non-violent, cruciform consent, the painful results of God letting us have our own way. And I just want to chip in here and make a point. When the non-believer or the believer despairs over the current state of things and the state of the world and life and humanity, what we need to remember is that all the conditions set in the material universe are as they have to be. Because if they were changed, we can talk about cosmological constants and everything, but if the conditions of the physical universe were changed just a little, you would not exist to question the state of affairs. So this is the only kind of existence in which you and I live, in which you and I can share our thoughts and question things. It's only in this context. Okay, so then questioning it becomes silly and undermines the whole project of question asking, in a sense, if you follow me there, if you don't ask a question later. So that was Brad Jarsak giving some thoughts. Here's another person. Rethinking the wrath of God is necessary because Jesus did not exhibit destructive wrath towards sinners. He did not exhibit anger at those who misinterpreted his Abba, but this was not the destructive. He did exhibit anger at those who misrepresented his Abba, Father. But this was not the destructive violence that is typically seen as the wrath of God. Even in the temple, which is literally the only scenario where Jesus expresses any kind of physical aggression, there is simply no evidence that Jesus inflicted any physical harm on anyone. He overturned tables, he drove them out. He did not wield a sword, slicing and dicing the money changers and turning the temple into a bloodbath. Again, we need to rethink the wrath of God in light of Jesus, who does not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them, and who is the perfect representation of the Father. There are certain biblical portraits of God that Christ rejected. He rebuked his disciples for trying to operate in the Old Testament call down fire on your enemies retributive response, which Jesus said was of a different spirit. Jesus also taught against the Old Testament eye for eye idea of God and said his heavenly Father loved his enemies, and if we imitate this, we are truly children of God. With the revealing of the Son then, we see a sharp distinction between the destruction of the Satan and the life-giving nature of the Father. The wrath of God then becomes an anthropomorphism of the destructive wages of sin. As Paul said, whoever sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap destruction. That is, sin has destructive consequences, and therefore people naturally thought that it was God who issued the destruction in his wrath. But if we look at Jesus, we see that God is out to save and heal us, not destroy us. And if we believe that God is out to both destroy us and save us from ourselves, destroying us, then we end up with a schizophrenic God. Again, look at Jesus' parable of the prodigal son. When the son left home, he ran into all sorts of complications that ended him up wasting away in a pig pen. This is the anthropomorphic wrath of God, but it's not the loving Father destroying his prodigal son. We know the attitude of the Father towards the prodigal son, and it's not wrath. Look at the parable of the lost sheep. The shepherd is not out to find the sheep so he can wrathfully destroy it for going astray, but to save it from its own self-destructive waywardness. Jesus never preached the wrath of God to sinners. He preached a God who came to give them life and heal them of their deadly sin disease. This is not to say Jesus did not warn of the natural destructive consequences of sin, symbolized by the fire of the valley of Hinnom, a loathsome place where dead bodies wasted away and burned to ashes. This is one time where Jesus used the word wrath, and he left the of God part off. Jesus knew wrath meant negative consequences, but there was a lot of mixed ideas on what God did and what the Satan did. Jesus clears this up for us. The Satan is the destroyer of men's lives, and the Father is the healer and redeemer and giver of life. I quote you again. The Bible is inhumanely consistent in portraying. So this is him quoting the guy who's saying that, God is just this forceful person at times, and we have to accept that and not question the inerrancy of the Bible. So he's quoting this guy. He says, I quote you, the Bible is inhumanely consistent in portraying Yahweh/Jesus as a warrior king who finely balances the demands of upholding his honor with the demands of his complete devotion to his covenant people. End quote. Exactly the opposite, actually. The Bible nowhere portrays Jesus as a warrior king upholding his honor, but rather in the book of Revelation, this whole Old Testament apocalyptic imagery of a warrior Messiah is subverted and turned completely upside down. No longer does the warrior hold a sword as depicted in the Old Testament, rather the sword is now coming out of his mouth. Subtle, yet huge difference. The sword therefore becomes metaphorical of his message. His robe is bloody before he has even gone into battle, signifying his own blood. Christ treads the winepress of the wrath of Almighty God by being the Lamb who was slain. The cross is the treading down of the nations and brings in the eschatological peace of the kingdom of God. John the Revelator is envisioning a Messiah who conquers the beastly system of the world by laying down his life, and his followers as doing the same. It is what the scholars have called violently anti-violent. In the Son, we see the full revelation of the Father as non-violent. But rather than this making Jesus a limp-wristed pansy-ass Nancy boy, the cross is the wisdom and power of God in casting down the powers and bringing God's kingdom into this world. Your Mark Driscoll Jesus does not exist. And he's speaking to someone called Dominic. It is a Jesus in your own image, which has not yet understood the wisdom and power of God in the crucified one. Then he offers grace and peace to this Dominic who said this. I'm sorry I can't credit the people who wrote this. I didn't take their names because I want our credit. No. But those are powerful words, aren't they? Those make us think. Those challenge our assumptions and preconceptions and loaded, pithy witticisms and the pettifoggery that often clouds the discussion. Let's be open-minded. Let's challenge ourselves. That's right, I speak like Sean Connery sometimes. Let's challenge ourselves. And I think this is thoroughly interesting and amazing, and it will lead to further rich discussions. Take it easy, folks. Bless you. And let me know what you think in the comments below. And particularly if you're not one who believes, see this as a place where you can come and share ideas and challenge things. And try to challenge yourself to ask questions that you wouldn't normally ask, and don't ask a question that sets you up for a win for your group. Ask a question that, I'm kind of interested in knowing something about this. And change the order of the question. If it's a question you've had before and you keep asking it and you think, I'm not getting anything, all the answers seem to be evasive, maybe your question's the problem then. Be clearer, challenge yourself, and maybe it's not, maybe you just haven't found someone who's able to answer your question appropriately, and maybe it's not even the substance of the answer that you're really looking for. It's more the understanding and empathetic tone you're looking for, so you've got something to kind of relate to. Maybe that's what you're after. I don't know. Sometimes that's a big part of it all. All the best, okay? Let me know what you think.